Welcome, everyone. It is February the 3rd, and it is Saturday, and it is 1:01 p.m. Eastern Time. We want to welcome you. This is part of the International African American Museum's series with the Center for Family History during the month of February, aka Black History Month. And we are kicking it off today with two special guests. I do first, before I introduce them, I want to welcome the folks that are at the museum and saying hello. And thank you for coming and visiting, and enjoy this session and this discussion. So I am going to share my screen, and then we're going to get started and get this topic rolling, and which is very personal to me. This is one of my favorite topics. So again, the title of the monthly webinar that we're starting off is From Revolution to Valor, the Legacy of African Americans' Military Service for the United States of America. So we start off typically with a little bit of Charleston trivia, and just giving you some clues for folks that have not visited the museum. So think about this. What is the size of a football field and a half? What is located on Gadsden's Wharf? What has 9 fabulous galleries? Who has the premier Center for Family History that provides educational programs for visitors both young and old? Who has membership opportunities? And all of those answers can be found and more at the main website of iaamuseum.org. And for any events in the next webinars, which are every Saturday, sponsored by the museum and the Center for Family History. And our director is Brian Sheffy. He's on the ground right now in the museum, so people are being able to watch this discussion. And also we have, and I'll start the introductions in a moment. Also, we have Whitney Day that is there also at the museum and should be monitoring our chat. Okay, a few reminders. The session is being recorded and will be available at a later date, probably within the next couple of weeks, on the YouTube channel for the museum. Please mute yourself while the discussion is going on. And if you're on camera, you can turn off your video, not the panelists. Closed caption is available for anyone that wants it. And if you have questions, please use the Q&A, and Whitney will monitor the Q&A sessions, chat that's going on, and we will address the questions at the end of the panelist discussion. And my name, since I didn't introduce myself yet, is Shelley Murphy. And so first, I'm going to welcome Dr. Janice Lovelace and Mr. Rick Murphy. If you will introduce yourself and tell us who you're associated with. And we'll start with Dr. Lovelace.
Well, thank you. I am, again, Janice Lovelace, and I live out in the West. I'm in Washington State. But I've really started looking at the military, beginning with the Revolutionary War and African Americans in the military. So that's one of the things that has fascinated me. Unfortunately, at least so far, I don't have a person who was in the Revolutionary War, but I do have military, World War I, to the Spanish-American War, the Civil War. And so that's what really got me interested in looking and seeing, what are we doing? Because I didn't learn about those things when I was growing up.
Yes, very,
Yeah.
very valid point. Most of us did not. So, Mr. Rick Murphy.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rick Murphy. I'm currently the President General of the Society of the First African Families of English America. It's an honor to be here on Black History Month, particularly on such a meaningful subject such as this here, where we're talking about men, women, and children who served our nation from the Revolutionary War to the present day, obviously with the emphasis of the Revolutionary War in 1812. And so many of us descend from these men, women, and children and don't even know about it. So I look forward to sharing information with you and perhaps learning from some of you as well. Thank you.
And we want to thank you both for giving up your Saturday for this time with us today. So what we will do for the audience purposes, and again, those of you that are live in the museum, you can funnel your questions right there. We will, ask for any questions from you. Those of you that are here online, use the Q&A box, the Q&A box. So I'm going to ask you panelists some questions and we'll go from there. So one of the first things I want to know is a historical recognition type question. In what ways do you think the contributions of African Americans during the Revolutionary War and possibly the War of 1812 have been underrepresented in traditional American history natives? And Janice, I'll start with you first.
Well, one of the first things for me is that I didn't hear much about African Americans in the Revolutionary War. I mean, when I was growing up, it was Crispus Attucks and that was it. And I went to an all-black school, K through 6, and we still did not hear about where were our folks? What were they doing during the Revolutionary War? And in terms of the War of 1812, nothing. You would think that Black people didn't even exist during that time.
Yeah.
But as I've begun to research and, kind of get past Crispus Attucks, really finding that beginning with Lexington and Concord, several Black men were part of the militia, and they were continually part of the colonial militias, and then the Continental Army once it got going. So
Absolutely.
I love the DAR book, The Forgotten Patriots, that gives us names of some folks who are involved, and then people can start researching from there.
And Rick, what do you think?
Well, if I might take the luxury of digressing a bit. One of the reasons why we don't know a lot about the Revolutionary War period, and particularly as people of color, as African Americans, we're grounded in the Civil War. And there's a reason for that. There weren't photographers during the Revolutionary War. There weren't cameras. There weren't a lot of people who followed the different battles and reported them in the various newspapers. So from that perspective, we need to understand the construct of the time period of the late 1700s versus some 50, 60 years later, which was the Civil War. During the Civil War, there were a lot of newspapers around the country, national and local, and they wrote about the war. They had pictures that they could put into the newspaper. And we also have to remember that there were a lot more Europeans who migrated during the Civil War period. So that really got integrated into the communities in which they came from. So now as we talk about the Revolutionary War, that was a time period where there weren't national newspapers and very, very few local newspapers. But what's more important, it's most unfortunate, since 2/3 of our ancestors had arrived here in the United States, in the 13 colonies, in what was called then British America. And despite the fact that 2/3 of our ancestors had arrived, there wasn't a lot that was written about them. And the second aspect, which I assume we'll get much more into, and I don't want to belabor too much, there were specific reasons why the history of the Revolutionary War was hidden from Americans of African descent. So I'm sure we'll get much more in that. So A, we didn't have photography, we didn't have pictures, and B, there were specific reasons why our history was hidden.
We definitely will dive into that. So can you share a story or a specific story or anecdote about an African-American figure from these wars that particularly stand out for their bravery or their strategic importance? And Janice, I know you mentioned Crispus Attucks. That's the only name I knew growing up, say in the 50s and 60s. And a couple other ones came along, but there was always, in my own house, military discussions with my dad because he loved that aspect of history. So share something that you know about someone, and it could be Christmas addicts. It's just your choice.
Right. Well, one of the folks, and let me pull up a screen here.
Sure.
One of the folks that I began to research was Barzillai Lou, who was a patriot, and he was free. He was born free. He was a musician as well. But one of the things that it really kind of struck me is that not only did he fight in the war, he got a pension. And so he left paperwork that we can then find. And he also had 12 children. So there are descendants of Barzillai Lou now that are around. And so when you have those descendants and you have that story, then you get more information about that person and about that family. And so many of the patriots are forgotten because there's not anybody who's descended from them who remembers. And so I think it's part of our responsibility is to find them and to bring them to light.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Rick?
Well, I can talk an awful lot about the bravery of the men, women, and children who served in the Revolutionary War. I descend from 8 of them. But I want to talk about an unusual character that I really think explains the mindset of those during that period of time. We first have to remember that there were approximately 10,000 men who served in the Continental and state militias. There was another 20,000 who fought on the British side who were men of color. So that's a large number of people. And I think we have to ask the question, to your question, why did they serve? And the one person who stands out for me was a young enslaved woman by the name of Phyllis Wheatley. And the reason she stands out is, number one, she was enslaved. Number two, she was able to read and write, and as a result of that, she wrote a number of poems. And her poems specifically challenged the issue of equality.
Yeah.
She wrote directly to the Commander-in-Chief, George Washington, and raised the issue of how can you go to war and defend the concept of liberty and democracy and freedom, but yet you deny liberty, democracy, and freedom to the Black man. So she really galvanized the whole discussion around the issues of the Revolutionary War, particularly as it pertains to people of color, specifically enslaved people. So I think she really was a catalyst for change. And Crispus Attucks, clearly the first man to die for the revolutionary cause, shouldn't be forgotten. But oftentimes we forget the heroic works of Phyllis Wheatley, and she was the first Black author to publish a book in America. So there are so many different aspects about her that I find so fascinating, and I think she's been underreported, misunderstood in terms of who she was, and she died as a poor woman, lost all of her children in childbirth, and during her last child being born, she died and her child died the day later. So I think she's really an important person. She didn't fight on the battlefield, but she certainly fought in many ways that galvanized all of those other Black men, women, and children to want to serve in the war.
Which is interesting that if she wrote poems and she had communication with George Washington, there could possibly, I would believe, some influence in there as well.
Oh, absolutely. And George Washington talked about her. So
Yeah.
yes, he was amazed, number one, in terms of her intellect, but was also amazed in terms of what she wrote. And he in turn wrote back to her according to his voluminous works of writing.
Now we know. And I see that Shannon Christmas in the chat put some links to about Whitley's poem, His Excellency General Washington. So for those of you that have access to the chat, you can link to the read what Rick is talking about. So thank you, Shannon. So another question, this is around impact on freedom. So we heard of someone that was born free, but we also heard about someone that was enslaved. And one thing I would like to clarify in that term patriots. And I'm thinking of the societies that are the ones that say this is a patriot or not. So for DAR and SAR, so Daughters of the American Revolution and the Sons of the American Revolution, a patriot basically, and you guys can correct me if I'm saying this wrong, is anyone that provided a service, they were a soldier, anything that helped the cause of getting away from the British. And I'm making it as simple as I can. And it just basically, if I was the person delivering blankets and food from my house to the soldiers or to the hospital, the services or whatever it is, then I could be tracked if I'm recorded or on some behalf or whatever. I could be labeled as a patriot in the eyes of the Daughters of the American Revolution. And if you two, either of you want to add anything to that, but it is really that simple. If you contributed, then you are recognized on the behalf of this country, breaking away from Great Britain. And I don't know, Rick, I'm sure you.
Yeah, and Shelley, you're absolutely correct, but it's a little bit more than that. So, so
Yes.
your broad definition is an accurate one, is an important one. But it also includes if you were actually in the service of the country or provided aid and comfort, you were a patriot, but you were also a founder of America.
Yes.
And how important that is for us as Black people to realize that our ancestors were founders of America. And see, that was one of the things that's been hidden from us intentionally. So sessions like this is so important that we begin to spread the word that our ancestors were founders of America.
Right there. And as you said, there's up to 10. And he mentioned men, but we also have women as well that participated. And I'm going to say on the line fighting too, not just the cooks or providing service and things like that. There are known women that were also fighting online. So another question, the impact on freedom and rights. How did the participation of African American soldiers in these wars or in the American Revolution War influence the debate and the evolution of freedom and civil rights in the early United States of America? And again, I always throw it to you, Janice, as here, and then we'll go to Rick.
Well, I think one of the interesting pieces for me is that Black folks fought on both sides.
Yes.
And the British promised freedom. And so it really says something to us that, 5,000 plus men signed up to say, yes, I want my freedom. I want to be away from this enslavement. And so I think that said something to other folks as well, like, oh, we need to be talking about freedom for everybody. And I do think that a lot of the Blacks who fought for the Patriot side thought, okay, this is going to mean freedom for all of us. And it, took another 100 years or almost 100 years for that to happen.
And whatever level that is.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Rick, did you want to add anything on here?
Well, again, I got to go back to the Civil War. And I think the Civil War discussion is always important to us because that's what we were taught in school. That's what we were grounded around.
Yes.
And one of the things that the Civil War we've come to understand was freedom and emancipation. And that's where we think that our people became free. But that freedom and emancipation was grounded on the Black men of the Revolutionary War, because this was the first time that large numbers of enslaved people became manumitted. And close to 80 to 85% of the Black men in the North and the South who served in the Revolutionary War were enslaved, and most of them became free. But more important than that, Massachusetts, and it's very interesting that we have to go back to Massachusetts. The war ended in 1783, And all of these Revolutionary War soldiers who were in Massachusetts went to the legislature and they went to the courts and said, we understood the concept of freedom. We now want to be free. And in 1783, the same year that the war ended, Massachusetts manumitted all of the enslaved people, first time ever. So that was the beginning of manumission.
Yeah.
So it didn't stop in the Civil War. And when Massachusetts did it, New Hampshire did it, Vermont did it, New York gradually did it, Pennsylvania. So all of a sudden, the dominoes were in effect that these men who served in the Revolutionary War began to demand not only their own freedom, but the freedom of the rest. And it was their sons, their grandsons who went first in the Civil War and became part of the United States colored troops to free those who were enslaved. So the Revolutionary War really played a huge role in the issue of manumission and emancipation.
Absolutely. And it's interesting, and I'm gonna throw this a little side note in here, is, George, and I'm saying this to the audience, George Washington did not want the Negroes involved. And and I'm just gonna say, but they wouldn't have been able to win without them.
And that's important, Shelley, that George Washington was a man of Virginia. George
Yes.
Washington was a man who did not travel outside of Virginia. So he had a very narrow view. So when he took command of the Continental Army up in Massachusetts and saw all these black men in the army, he had a philosophical problem.
Yes.
But the greater problem for him was he realized he couldn't win the war without the black soldiers.
Yes.
And that's one of the things that's been hidden from us, was that internal debate that he had, that he realized he could not win the war without us. And again, that's in his papers.
Awesome. Thank you all for that. So again, I'm going to go to the women. What roles did African American women play during these conflicts, and how were their contributions? And I made one comment about, a woman, and what made their contributions unique to the war efforts. And I do want to say, if Karen K or someone in the chat can put in the book by Karen Cook Bell, and she talks about the women, and that's a reference there. And so I'll throw it back to the panelists, but that is a good book. It's one of my favorites, and she talks about the Black women of the Revolutionary War. So Janice?
Well, certainly if we think that the history of Black participation in the Revolutionary War was kind of hidden, the participation of Black women was, deeply hidden. But certainly for free families, for free women, it was about supporting the men to fight. It was about keeping the home fires going and providing food and blankets and what you had talked about before in terms of helping. I have not read much about women who actually fought. And so, I would love to hear more about that if
That
you
book.
know more about it. Yeah.
Karen Cook's book. And just before Rick responds, the name of the book is Running from Bondage: Enslaved Women in Their Remarkable Fight for Freedom in the Revolutionary America. And I will say this, during this time, there was more women escaping slavery than men. And not only were we saying the individual women, they were bringing their babies with them.
That's right.
And I think that is significant. And some had to dress up as a man and they're on the line and so forth. But again, that book is amazing. So Rick, I'll let you respond about any women if you would like to comment.
Right. I think Janice is absolutely correct. I mean, a lot of them played those critical roles back at home in terms of maintaining the home front, maintaining the children, and also maintaining the spirit. But Shelley, you're equally right that the African American woman was underrepresented, if the Black man was underrepresented, the Black
Yes.
woman clearly was underrepresented. Many of these of women in general, white and Black, followed their husbands at the time of war. In the Black community, we're now finding out that many of these men served for 48 months, 58 months, 68 months, 78 months. So they spent a long time away from home, and their wives and children followed them. Many of these women provided crucial camp support. Many of them were nurses. Many of them brought their African skills in understanding medicine and how to heal. The Revolutionary War is a very brutal war, a very bloody war, was actual hand-to-hand combat with bayonets, with guns firing at short ranges. So these women brought their skills and tended to the health and the welfare of the men. So they were critical to the support. And we're learning more and more that we only saw men who receive federal pensions. We're now seeing women, including African American women, who receive pensions because Washington allowed them to receive money during the war for the services that they provided, just like the men. So African American women played a crucial role. And during the battles, which I did not know until the last 4 or 5 months, during the battles, the women congregated around the trees. And as the battle was going on, they went out as a man fell, brought him to the trees to tend his wounds, and they did a triage. And depending if he just fell because he was dehydrated, they gave him water and pushed him back in. Or if he could survive, they sent him to the next post behind them to be treated. So African American women played a crucial role in the Revolutionary War.
And I'm going to add another name in, and I'm going to say the American name, and it's Nancy Ward. And Nancy Ward was Native American. Her husband was a chief. And there was a little bit on the last Finding Your Roots show, some connection with one of the guests, but they missed so much more to tell. So I will say one thing. The chief got shot. Just like Rick said, the women were there with their husbands following with them. The chief gets shot on the battleground. Nancy picks up his gun and commenced the fighting. And the rest is story. Y'all can go read about it and things like that. But again, that importance of the women, we were there. We were there standing with our men in this, that, and the other, and with our children.
And
So
Shirley,
the next, go ahead.
One final thing. We're learning today so much about what took place back then.
Yes.
A lot of these women did not trust the care that their husbands and sons would receive on the battlefield. They were afraid they were going to be left to die.
Yes.
So they decided they were going to go. So in the event something happened to them, they would be the ones who would tend them.
Yes.
What a phenomenal concept for women to think about. I'm going to protect so the husbands were protecting the wives, but they went to battle to protect specifically their husbands because they didn't know how they were going to be treated. I'm sorry, Janice.
Family. No, absolutely correct. And that's the importance of family. And I always say, even linking this back to slavery, one of the biggest atrocities that happened was the breakup of that family regarding slavery. You know, so, okay, so let's go back to the question here. In what ways did African-American culture and values shape the ethos and strategies of the American forces during these conflicts? What do you think came forward, Janice? And
Well,
I'm sorry,
certainly,
Dr. Lovelace, I'm sorry.
certainly the piece about, you know, the women taking care of the men, that was, I think, definitely a part of the African perspective of kind of taking the village. But more than that, I also think from a larger perspective, the values of what becomes the United States were the values of slaveholders. And they're up against here Black men fighting, and yet I'm holding these Black men and women enslaved.
Mhm.
But the white leaders were not really thinking that the black soldiers were going to be as good. And again, that's that sort of slaveholder mentality of, well,
Mhm.
they can't be as good as we are. And yet the black men were like, yeah, I can shoot, I can fight,
Right.
I'm right up here on the front line. And so I,
And I
I
don't
think that
think
began to
they,
push that.
yeah, I don't think they thought anything of the women either. And
Oh no,
that's why there were so many successes. And just like you said, even the triage around the tree, they
Yeah.
never expected that these men and women were capable of what they did.
and
And that
even
the
more.
value is still not there. And this is why we're having this talk right now.
Well, and even with the unit out of Rhode Island, which was an all
Yeah.
black militia unit, they're white leaders.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, you can't, you can't lead.
That even went all the way to the Civil War.
Right. Well, and after, I mean,
Yeah.
when we look at the Buffalo Soldiers, and it's on.
Yes.
Yep.
Rick?
Culture played a very interesting aspect of the war. And if I can digress a bit, the Society of the First African Families, we have been hosting every other week a series of meetings with historians, scholars, authors, to look at the Revolutionary War through the perspective of the Black soldiers. I know Renata's on the call here. She's one of our leaders on the project, as well as you, Shelley. And we've learned so much through this process. And one of the things that we learned through our medical advisors is that George Washington was part of the French and Indian War. And he saw firsthand how the English used germ warfare against the indigenous. So he was very sensitive to the fact that the English probably would use germ warfare against the Americans. And when he was in Boston, he learned something from Cotton Mather's experiments with the enslaved in Boston, and that was the inoculation of smallpox.
Mm.
And the enslaved in Boston had brought the custom of inoculation from Africa to America and taken the cow pus or the pus of the virus,
Us.
putting it under the skin, and it protected people from getting smallpox. So when Washington was in Boston, he learned that from Cotton Mather. Cotton Mather learned that from the enslaved Africans, and Washington inoculated all of the men in the Revolutionary War. Every single man had to be inoculated from smallpox for fear that the English were going to subscribe to germ warfare. I can't think of any better thing that we learned from our African brothers and sisters in terms of the inoculation of smallpox. So Renata and the rest of us, as we learned this, and you as well, we were blown away that who would have thought that a custom in Africa, brought here by the enslaved, educated the doctors in Boston, educated George Washington, and that became a health standard of the Revolutionary War. Who would have ever thought?
And now we know.
Now we know.
We know. So, and again, I'm loving this conversation, and folks are putting things in the chat. And a lady named Kathleen says, read Pax Americana.
That's
So
right.
that will bring it right there.
Absolutely.
All right. So next question, and this is around some challenges and some hardships. And also part of this, even though I'm asking what are some of the specific challenges and hardships that were faced by African American soldiers during this time, how did you see that they overcome, say, within your research? And so now I'm going to put my genealogist hat on, but there were challenges. And how have you seen that some of them were overcome? And then the challenges of conducting this type of research also comes along. And so I go to you, Dr. Lovelace.
Well, certainly one of the biggest challenges that I think about is being underrepresented, not thought that you're going to be as good as. And so therefore directing some of the Africans that were used in the war to doing labor and construction and food service, and not sort of thinking about them as being soldier material. So I think that was a challenge for those African men, become African Americans, and yet they continued. And they did. They picked up the guns, and maybe you have me doing labor, but when you're in a war, there really isn't a difference between, who's fighting, and you don't get to say, oh no, don't bother me because I'm cooking. You're still part of that war effort. And I think that they then took up that challenge and proved that they also could fight and do an equally good job of being soldiers.
So that's also a mindset I'm hearing.
Yeah.
What you're saying, that those individual men had a mindset. I can do this. This is my job. But I'm also going to throw back, also thinking about freedom.
Yep.
Because that's what they were promised.
Yep. Yep.
And that was their goal. Some of their goal.
Yeah.
Rick?
Well, absolutely. During the beginning of the war, the African American man, in many instances, and I have to pause when I say the African American man, because many men who enlisted in the Revolutionary War were born in Africa. So they
Yes.
were actually Africans. They were looked down upon in terms of who they were and what skills that they had. But what's really important, as the war progressed, they really began to realize the significant skills that these African men brought to the table. Equally important, George Washington had a hard time in maintaining his troop strength. And the European soldiers served from 3 to 9 months. And when the battle left their community, they went back to the farm.
Yeah.
Black men, when they were promised their freedom for a year, they stayed. And when they realized that if they stayed for 3 years, they'll get bounty land. And something also happened along the way. As enslaved men, they began to receive paychecks. So what would an enslaved man do? Well, he would certainly stay the year to get free. He certainly would stay 3 years to get land, and he certainly would stay throughout the duration of the war to get a paycheck to send home to the family. And as a result of that, even though early on they were perceived to only do menial tasks, they really became the hardened army that the colonists, that the Continental Army, that the commander-in-chief needed. So they were no longer looked at just as subservient men, as soldiers. And as we look at the descendants, and as the descendants today are now doing the research on their ancestors, the whole concept of who these men were during the Revolutionary War has now been flipped on its head.
Yeah.
And I think as we move towards America 250, as we move towards 1775, which is a year from now, when we start talking about the Black soldier, we're not just going to be talking about them as cooks and cleaners and doing latrines. We're going to start talking about them as being hardened soldiers, because they walked 500 miles from one battle, then 500 miles to another battle. These were hardened soldiers. And when you start to look at the written works by these generals, they all cite different African American men in their written work in terms of what they did to help win these individual battles. I think this whole concept is going to be turned on its head. And let me say one final thing, and I'm going to talk fast. The history of these men were intentionally erased from the history books, because when these men from Massachusetts, after the war, they no longer received paychecks. They became merchant marines. They served on the ships, and they were going from Boston, New York, and Philadelphia to Alexandria, to Norfolk, to all these Charleston, all these port cities. And they were talking about how they were now free men. And that's when you start to look at all the slave revolts after the Revolutionary War to the 1820. So they created problems for these southern states, and they had to erase this off the history books because they didn't want anyone to know that black soldiers had guns and they were killing white people and Englishmen. So clearly there was something that was going on, and that's the legacy that they have. And folks like Renata and you, Shelley, and others who are helping us write this story, this is a phenomenal story that's going to be told.
And again, I love just saying that statement. We were never the problem, but we were also there. And weren't recognized, and I'm saying that as in the people, African Americans and Africans, because there were differences on how soldiers that we see now that are recognized and rewarded or even compensated. And was there not a difference in pay that was received from the white
No,
soldiers?
no.
You know, were they paid the same?
Yes,
And
they
was
were
the
all
pensions the
yes,
same?
yes. Well, pensions are different.
Okay, so all right,
They receive the same paycheck.
yes,
Pensions are different because even to this day, the federal government does not want any soldier to get a pension.
right.
So they had to go through an awful lot of hoops to get those pensions. And Janice mentioned the Forgotten Patriots book by the Daughters of the American Revolution. Everybody throws this number 5,000. We have known since 2008
Yeah.
that there were 6,631 men who were African men who received, African indigenous men who received pensions.
Yes.
There probably were as many who didn't get their pensions because they couldn't prove their service or they were ineligible. So yes, they got the same paycheck. Because they were so valuable. And you got to remember, a lot of these cream puffs didn't want to serve in the war, so they used black men as their substitutes.
Substitutes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So there were so many different dynamics that were going on during the Revolutionary War, but these black men came out of that war and they were different than what they were in. And the genie was out of the jar, out of the bottle, so they had to treat these men differently.
Yes. And again, under-recognized, we're not learning we have generations that have no knowledge of this that's going on and who participated. And one of the things with that 2000, and for folks, the Forgotten Patriots research that was done in 2008, it's somewhat incomplete, you know, but that's the basis of what we have, you know, right now. So I have to commend that Society of the First African Families of English America, because this is another segment of documenting Africans and African Americans in this country. And we're documenting them being alive prior to March 5th, 1770, which is a crucial point because that's the day when Christmas Addis died. That's the Boston Massacre. So we're this society, and Rick could chime in on more on this, but this society has got their members are documenting their ancestors. Some that are going to fight or have fought in the Revolutionary War, but also that they're there. They're landowners. They're this, they're that. This is a whole nother segment of our history as an African American that people don't know about. And so again, I give kudos to this society that has now stepped up. And then after that society, you've got the sons and daughters of the U.S. Meadow Passage to take you through that next time, period. And again, underrepresented, not untold stories and so forth. So I want to go on to another question. And how do these stories that we're all learning about these men and women have been preserved or commemorated within the local communities and with their families? And I'm saying, how have they or how have they not been? So I'm making that a twofold question because we're trying to get there. And again, things like this webinar with the Center for Family History, the 250 Project, you got the society going on, and you've got DAR that have the Patriots of Color from their book, their database, but there's so much more. and I'll throw it to you, Janice. Are they being recognized, or should they? Do you know of any community that has put forth effort on recognize African American patriots and men and women?
I think that there are more communities that are stepping up, genealogy groups as well as DAR groups that are saying, well, where were the patriots of color? Especially in the northern states, not so much in those southern states that were southern colonies. But saying, okay, can we find out more information? Can we make some sort of monument to this individual? Can we encourage our schools within our state or even within a town or community to add this information? Can we have a day when we're talking about patriots or we're talking about the war? Can we have a time then that we include this? So it's happening, but it's happening sort of hit and miss. It's like, if somebody drives it forward, but not so much nationwide kind of information. Let's talk about how Africans were involved from the very beginning in the building of this country.
Which is interesting because my involvement with I'm going to say just any of the America 250, the only question I said, don't leave out the African American men and women patriots. And that's it. And, don't leave them out, and it's like, what do you mean? What are you talking about? So Rick, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, again, I constantly draw a connection between the Revolutionary War and the Civil War. And I think because we as a people are grounded in the Civil War, and that's been drilled into our heads, and we don't realize that the dots are connected between the Revolutionary War and the Civil War. What I mean by that is these Revolutionary War men they were free, they were freed, but over 85% of them were enslaved. And I look at them as gateway ancestors. So as gateway ancestors, they take you to present day, but they also take you back. And Janice is absolutely correct. Many of these communities, they have that documentation and they've not shared it. They know who these men who came from their communities. They know the families, and they've not shared it. So I challenge everybody to go into those communities and say, what do you have? And it's okay if they put it up on their website, but if they only leave it in a small sphere and don't make it national, do you realize how many descendants these people have all around the country, and they have no concept that their ancestors were part of this? If 2/3 of our ancestors were here during the Revolutionary War, then 2/3 of us should be able to make those connections to the Revolutionary War, and we don't know about it. Now, we're going to start in our own database at the Society of the First African Families. We're going to start to open up our database and take those family names to the early to the mid 1800s, so families and descendants today can now know about their ancestors. Because Shelley, you and I, although not related, both have the name Murphy. If we did just our genealogy on Murphy, we wouldn't have found all of these people with whom we're related to. We got to start looking at the broader spectrum of all the names of who we're related to. And once those names start coming forward, more and more people, and as you know, Shelley, we got all these people now who want to join the society because they're now finding out these names. Now they're coming up with the paperwork, but it's mind-boggling. All of these folks are beginning to realize, wow, I can actually go back to the Revolutionary War. We don't know that. And that comes from the information at the local communities around the country. And folks say, well, they're just on the East Coast. No, many of these men got land grants and land patents, and they moved west. And then their descendants continue to move west. They move south. And many of those in the South also in those communities. So there are many, many ways that we can make those connections. So it's actually up to the local communities to do that.
And you're making a great point, and now the genealogist hat's coming on. We know there's already challenges for African American research. We automatically know, and it doesn't matter what time era we're looking at it. We're still faced with some of these challenges, in which we've also discussed, pretty much throughout. Not talked about, not documented, or the documents are now surfacing because there's so much dialogue and stuff that's going on. And I even think about the 1619 and Calvin Pearson down in the Hampton area. What was it, 20 some years he worked at trying to
That's right.
signal, wait a
Mhm.
minute, wait, this is what happened, and this. So please start sharing. So now, and I'll say the city of Hampton has a landing day. Every
right.
year they celebrate the landing day of the ship coming in with the first 20 and odd per se, 32 and odd. And you got to know that history. That's a whole nother discussion. But just the fact that they know, and we talk about the challenges of doing the research. So what is a tip that you could give? So if someone is saying, I can get folks in the Civil War, but how do I get to the Revolutionary War to know if I have somebody? Could each of you share a tip? And Rick, you already gave one per se, but I want you to give another one. And that is the local community. You have to exhaust that local community on all your research, no matter what time it is, but even more so during this Revolutionary War time. And I'll make a comment that in the Charlottesville area where Thomas Jefferson was at, you also have James Monroe. You also have Madison. But what is around locally is Civil War information, not as much American Revolutionary War. And all of those presidents were around that time of the Revolution. The Robert E. Lee statute was taken down, but that was Civil War. Where is Shadrach Battle's statute? Or any of the other, say, Black Revolutionary War patriots, or even white? They're just not here. So again, what could you give to the audience as far as a tip? Maybe even how do you get started? And Janice, I'll go to you first, because you went and started doing this research. And what would be your best tip that you would share?
Well, certainly, I think if you're looking at folks in the North who were either emancipated immediately, like in Massachusetts and Vermont, or if you're looking at folks who got gradually emancipated, there's there's a significant amount of documentation of that gradual emancipation. So if you have those folks in the North, you can begin to look at some of the paperwork that the government produced around emancipation, around the gradual emancipation, and then once they're emancipated, looking for them on the censuses. We tend to think, oh, Black folks aren't on the census. Well, yeah, they are if they're free. So how can you start at the Civil War and go backwards? And again, in the North, easier than it is in the South. So my tip is to just kind of start with the Civil War, that post-Civil War, the 1870. If you have somebody who fought in the Civil War, maybe you can find that they had who their slaveholder was, and go backwards from that point.
Okay, Rick?
Well, we're fortunate. You mentioned Calvin Pearson's 1619 project. And many of us thought that goes back 400 years. There's no way we can do that research. And the reality is it's a major challenge, but it's not impossible. We have folks like Renata Yarbrough Sanders, who's from the OGS chapter of the Hampton Roads. They're doing a phenomenal job and beginning to open up this new knowledge around the Revolutionary War and how do we make these connections. So one piece of advice is begin to work with your local OGS chapter and find out what they're doing to make the connections between the Revolutionary War and the Civil War. And if they aren't doing something, certainly encourage them to begin to make those connections. Certainly going into your state archives, they were required by law to capture information on the men who served in those state battles. They've got documentation. If you're in this is not just a North issue, it's a South issue, because many of those plantation owners had to document what they did around the Revolutionary War, and oftentimes they also put information about their enslaved people. We thought there was no documentation. Boy, were we wrong.
We were
This
wrong.
stuff is just pouring out because the stuff is there. The federal archives, they have a wealth of information. You got to know what county your people came from. The states have information. You got to know what county your people came from. The local governments have information on your ancestors. You got to know what county your people came from. Don't be afraid. Don't shy away from this stuff. And if you want to volunteer with the Society of the First African Families because you think your folks may, let me know, because we meet every other week. This is becoming a phenomenal experience that it's like, it's like mind-boggling what we're learning collectively. So don't be afraid to paddle in this little pond and see whether or not it's applicable, because we're learning so much around this. We're going to come up with 5 books on each of the theater of wars and explain the Revolutionary War through the eyes of the Black soldier, and we're going to do 5 documentaries. So it's going to take us a while. Hold on to your hats. We're phenomenal. We look forward to you coming along with us, because we're going to help you find your ancestors. We're going to help you find your people.
Absolutely. And I do want to make comment. Brian posted in the chat that also look at the local history books, look at Google books. There are books on the African Americans, as far as their service, books about individuals. Google is always your friend, always your friend. And if you're on social media, look for the Facebook pages that might have American Revolution, part of the name or something like that. Or look at the counties that you're researching in and start asking questions. And one of the things, and I thought Rick was going to mention this, but I'm going to say it. Once you cross that line, and I'm saying it in my words, from the Civil War, and you start looking during these colonial times, follow that land, follow those deeds, follow the property, because that's where you might find names. That's where you will see if you have ancestors. Every parent or ancestor you have in the Civil War had a mama and daddy and had a grandparent. So you're already back there now.
That's right.
And finding them out. And yes, there are records. You also, another side tip would be understand what law was in place at the time. And if you're looking at Civil War, Revolutionary War, what was the law? And find out from there, because if you know the law, then you might know where the records could be, because the law is going to say the county's got to do this or the state's got to do this and so forth. So also recognize that there's census that were available around that time. And I can only speak as far as Virginia, but coming forward, you never know if there was a list of the Revolutionary Patriots. Who wrote about it? Who indexed that? So there's a wealth of information that could be out there that you could search just asking Google a simple question. So I do have another research type question, and then we'll get to Whitney for any questions from the audience. During the Civil War, we had substitutions, and people were able to substitute. Did the American Revolution also have the substitute availability that, and I'm going to say this way, and I'll say a slave owner let one of his slaves be substituted for him? And did they get compensated that if they allowed their slave or enslaved person to partake in the revolution?
The short answer on the first part is yes.
Yeah.
And on the second part, maybe.
Yeah.
Now, many of these slaveholders had sons who were supposed to serve. So they would use an enslaved person to substitute. but oftentimes the money came to the slaveholder, and the slave
Yeah.
person, male or female, never saw that money.
Right.
So excellent question. So yes, there were substitutes, and it was a big problem, particularly in the South. So when the slaveholder didn't want their sons to serve because it was a bloody, bloody war, they had substitutes, but that money came to the slaveholder.
And I think right off the top of my head, in some of the research that I'm doing in Central Virginia on the Black Patriots, Thomas Jefferson sent 4 of his enslaved people. One of them was a woman, and her name was Mary Hemmons, who also became a prisoner. And so again, there's records, there's information. And I think the genealogy wise, you're going to run into challenges, but you heard the local community, find out about the state archives, find out who was in that county that served. Does the historical society have information? But don't forget the public libraries. Find out what's in their holdings, and also find out we got the SAR and the DAR. And so those are also records. And you're also thinking of the Society of the First African Families. Also, these people might have information that can be shared. And don't forget the universities. Yes, Rick?
Because our mindset is around the Civil War,
Yeah.
and our mindset is around that those who were enslaved or blacks during the Civil War period weren't very smart. If they couldn't control us, they wanted to define us. But what we find out about the Revolutionary War, that these men were sharp as a tack. 2 points. One, when they saw their day of freedom after the Revolutionary War, many of them got rid of their slave names and took on new names. So they wanted to make sure everyone knew they were no longer a slave because they took on new names. Number 2, many of them got rid of their first slave names. I descend from Cuffy Clapp Jr., and he changed Cuffy to Charles and his last name to Grandison. So this begins to show the sophistication. And many of these men, when they died, in their wills, they left family genealogies to make sure that everybody knew who their children were and what they were supposed to get if it was nothing more than a quill mattress. So there's a lot. These men were sharp as a tack. And when they went up and down the coast in these military troops, they learned from one another. So there's a lot of sophistication there.
And the skills that they had is another point. And so, and for here, I want to conclude it here so we can see what questions that are coming from the chat. And I did see one is, what is DAR? And Jennifer politely answered it for us. So DAR, and sorry for us referencing just the initials, that is the Daughters of the American Revolution, which is a lineage society. SAR is Sons of the American Revolution. They have databases of people that served. What's also included in their database are people of color. It's not all. And there's also some that are yet to be defined and added to. And so that's why there's the importance of these other groups, these society, and that the research continues. So Whitney, I'm going to turn it over
Shelley,
to
can I
you.
just tag
Oh,
along on that
sure.
for one quick second?
Go ahead.
If you go to
We're good
DAR,
on time. We're good.
if you can go to dar.org,
Yes.
DAR.org, and look for the E Pluribus Unum page, there you will find the book titled Forgotten Patriots. And that book is in PDF form. So you can download the book and look up names either by state or by last name.
Yes.
They also now have a database where you can put names in. So all these different organizations are trying to make this easier and easier for us.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you for that. And I see people already put the link in. And so Whitney, I'm going to turn it over to you for questions to the panelists.
Yes, we have a couple of questions. So one of the questions that came from the conference room here at the museum was, did slave owners seek or get compensation for slaves who ran away and fought with the British or just left with the British? And then with that, if they did, where are those compensation records found?
So I will jump in and say that yes, some of them did. They requested compensation. The British reviewed their request and granted compensation in some cases. You'll find that in the British archives, but there's also a list at NARA, the National Archives here in the US, the Book of Negroes. And that is basically saying, I'm requesting you to compensate me for this particular person. And I actually have, I can share my screen real quickly and maybe show you what that
And
looks
by the way,
like.
the Book of Negroes is documenting 3,000 Negroes that are going to Canada, basically Nova Scotia and other places, or back
Right.
to Britain.
So
Oh,
these are
go
the folks
ahead.
who went with the British, and you can see that, you know, people asked, here's a claimant saying,
Mhm.
you took my folks and give me money back. So you can find this at the National Archives.
Yes.
Now, one thing about the Book of Negroes,
Yeah.
this book only deals with those Americans of African descent who came out of New York. And they went to Francis Tavern and they had to prove, and I served on one of their boards, they had to prove their relationship to a loyalist out of New York. So although it's the Book of Negroes, it's a very defined book. So when you think of 3,000 people just coming out of that small Manhattan Island, that just gives you an idea of the magnitude of this.
Mhm. And there was also a movie, if folks had not seen that movie. And just recently, the Nova Scotia Black Loyalist Museum was on a talk. And I'm going blank, and I apologize for that, but it was just within the last few days. Were you there, Whitney? Were you watching that? But the museum people on the Black Loyalist Museum up in Nova Scotia, um, we're talking about the museum, the components, the individuals, the families, and so forth. And if I can find it, I will post it on the Center for Family History Facebook page so people can watch that talk. And it was interview.
I think it was Genealogy Adventures, if I remember right.
It was. Thank you.
I was like, Brian and I were talking about the other day at work. He said about it, and I was like, dang it, I missed it.
So that is on their page. You can go to Genealogy Adventures, which is a program every Sunday at 4 p.m. They just had the Black Loyalist folks from the museum and couple descendants on that did this whole discussion, and it was excellent and things like that. So
And last year,
anyway,
Shelley, the Society of the First African Families gave their executive director an honorary award from the society for the work that she and others are doing up there in Nova Scotia in
awesome.
terms of writing the history, in terms of what took place during the Revolutionary War and right after.
Absolutely. Okay, so we answered that question. Is there another one?
Yes. Why have historians within the last few decades omitted African Americans present in these wars?
Ooh, that's a good one. Who asked that question? Thank you for that. All right, Janice.
Well, because we emit so much about African Americans and our part in the United States and the development and the growth of the United States. I don't think it was any different than we don't talk about some of the inventions of African Americans, and we don't talk about all the other things that we have added to this country. But the records are there, so we can go find those records and shine the light and let people know and encourage then schools to talk about that and to teach that so we don't have yet more generations coming along going, I never heard about that. We didn't know that African
Mhm.
people did these kinds of things.
Dr. Murphy,
Rick?
can I respond to that?
I was I was a little hesitant. I thought I should answer instead of him, but go ahead, Rick. Go ahead.
Can you ask the question again?
I'm holding on for pressure. This is being recorded. So thank you for the great question. But go ahead, Whitney, ask the question again.
Why have historians in the last few decades omitted African Americans present in these wars?
My short answer is they didn't know any better.
Yes.
And I think that's important.
Yes.
Number two, I said previously, and this is my new mantra, if they can't control us, they can't define us. And they can't define the narrative that we were founders of America. That's a concept that particularly white historians can't get their head around.